I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zives Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hi,
and welcome to Arcane Mark.
Coming to you here live on YouTube today. Today we are going to be talking about coordinating with other players. And there's a lot of ways that you can coordinate with other players. Broadly speaking, we're going to talk about mechanical coordination first, and then we're going to get more into story and narrative type coordination.
That's right. So we're going to talk about 3 types of mechanical coordination, and then we're going to talk about 3 types of narrative coordination today on the show. So let's get started. The first part of mechanical coordination that we're going to talk about is coordinating your character's builds. Now, as with a lot of things on this show, coordination can begin with session 0.
Absolutely.
Now, when we're talking about player coordination in this episode, that's very specifically going to be not with the GM, just like there's another GM and then Linda and I are both playing as player characters and we decided to coordinate.
Mm-hmm.
Because in a lot of our episodes, we talk about how the GM can help coordinate. The GM is often a coordinator, but 2 players can coordinate amongst themselves in order to possibly take the load off the GM, to enrich the gameplay experience, or both.
And also to make sure that they are getting what they're looking for out of the game. And this is one of the things that you'll often see early on in a campaign as people are planning for their characters, saying, "Oh yeah, well, I'm thinking I might play a wizard or maybe a cleric. What do other folks want to play?" This is in terms of coordinating what kinds of niches characters are filling. This could be things, broadly speaking, like, a spellcaster versus a martial. But it can also be things like, do we have somebody who can heal? Do we have somebody who can, get up in the front and tank? Do we have somebody who can deal damage at range? That kind of thing. Looking for are these kind of do we have somebody who can? Another good thing to look at is the skills. Do you have somebody who can do the primary skills? Like if you're coming together with a group and nobody's got thievery and you run into a trap, then you might have some problems. And
That's right.
The GM and the players could find a way to work around that, but it's often easier to say, "Hey, let's figure out what we're gonna do to get around that." And like in things like Pathfinder Society, where you're not necessarily gonna know what your team is, then your characters might wind up needing to be more versatile to handle that, or the adventures have to be more flexible. But if you are one thing you can do with society is if you have multiple characters that you can bring to a table,
that's what I was going to suggest.
You can then be ready to pull them in.
The coordinating mechanical of builds in Pathfinder Society is absolutely a shuffle dance of having multiple characters and being like, well, okay, but if you bring that one and I bring this one, what can that combine? You can't tailor make the characters to match each other, but you can, if you have multiple characters, potentially get into a situation where maybe it's a little more balanced for your group. Now, that all said, you don't have to do that to have a successful group. And Linda is mostly talking about macro, high-level components of your character's builds. You can also coordinate smaller elements of your character's builds. You can do things like taking the sniping duo archetype in Guns and Gears, where you're specifically coordinating with another player's character who's going to be your spotter. You can do things like taking a spell that you know will help your allies specifically, or taking Bon Mot on your character to lower the will saves of your enemy because you know you have many allies who target will.
Yeah, or even looking at things like, okay, well, I know that my party has a good way to get status bonuses to this particular, to attack rolls. So I don't need to take a spell to get status bonus to attack rolls. I want to focus on something else. If you have a bard, for example, then you might not need take like, oh, the other person doesn't necessarily need to learn.
Like you might not need bless as your as one of your starting first level oracle spells if you know you have a bard, because that bless is a lot less valuable at first level when the bard can just do their bard thing. If we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd edition. And if we're talking about like D&D, then that would be a situation where if you know you have someone who can give advantage to a certain type of check, like constantly, like they can hardly help but give advantage to that check, then you might not want to take options that will allow you to get advantage to that check because you already had advantage. Anything that doesn't that sort of overlaps and does not cumulatively apply is something that you can talk it out, figure out what that would be, and then work around so that you're not repetitively doing the same thing.
Yeah. And if one player has an easier way to do it, like the bard, just like, oh, I can just perform, then it makes sense for the player to choose a different spell. Whereas, because if the player chooses a different spell, then they can do something completely different. Sometimes there is value to having multiple people be good at something, because you might be like, okay, yeah, I see, like, I see there's a message in chat, like, that's a weird approach. Everyone in the party needs to max out intimidation when the party has a bard with whatever the remaster's name for Dirt of Doom is.
So in that case, in Pathfinder 2, that would be being a party that all stack the same frightened debuff onto an enemy and doesn't do anything. But see, that's the thing about coordinating with other players, is you could avoid doing that, even though you might see a solo optimization guide that says, oh yeah, absolutely, you want to take Demoralize, it's a very good debuff, but if you found out that your party has something that's going to frighten constantly, then you don't need it. But maybe it means that your rogue should take the Dread Striker feat so that all of the opponents will be taking sneak attack damage all the time, because you know that frightened is going to be up all the time.
And sometimes, it is still worthwhile to overlap with other characters if you know that something is going to be really important. Like, if you have a campaign where, there's going to be tons of arcane magic going around, it doesn't hurt to have multiple people that are good at Arcana so you can make sure that, like, somebody does well on the recall knowledge. It's not a, hey, never overlap, but it's more of a matter of, if there's a thing that only one person at a time can do, trying not to have a lot of people who are focused in necessarily doing that thing.
Right. I mean, sometimes you might decide that you do want to have extra focus in something to push your party over the top at being so obscenely good at it that it makes your party able to win encounters more easily.
Or, like, for example, let's say that your party loves using social solutions to encounters. Having multiple people that are good at diplomacy could be really legit, and then you can split up and try different strategies. Or, like, Rohit's talking in chat about having multiple people having medicine.
Yeah. And healing is another example where if you have enough healing and mitigation, like, having none is not really usually a good idea in Pathfinder 2. In some other D20 games where offense can be so overpowered that you just kind of rocket tag win, maybe you can do a strategy with none. But in Pathfinder 2, having some healing mitigation can be good, and with like heavy offense. But there's also a very legitimate strategy where you stack up a whole bunch of it. And you also try to have enough offense that you can end the fight, but that you're capable of pivoting to, like, a very mitigation focused strategy, and that can actually be successful. And so when we say coordinating, it doesn't mean you always have to get out of each other's way when you're making a build. It can be synergistic. It can be something that builds off of it. Is like, wow, you give everybody resistance, well, mine says it reduces the enemy's damage. And over there, we have another player who gives temporary hit points all the time. These are, like,
these work
really powerful when you use them together, because the temporary hit points will last longer while the damage is reduced and we have resistance.
Another thing that's worth considering with that is if your group is one where you don't always have the same exact players every time because someone might be busy or something like that, and then you have, like, a build that depends upon one character, having a second character can do that too. Like, for example, if you are, like, a really sneaky group that depends upon follow the experting off of someone who's actually good at stealth, and that player is not available, then having someone else be good at stealth and take follow the expert could be worthwhile as a backup.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had that very specific thing happen in a campaign where it's like, the player who actually is good at stealth hasn't been here in a while. We should probably shore that up.
Yeah, because if your team sneaks all of the time and somebody doesn't even have stealth, you're really not going to be able to do anything unless you have at least one expert for them to follow in Pathfinder 2. So these are all examples of how you can work together with other players to coordinate builds. Sometimes it's to make a super combo, sometimes it's to get out of each other's way, or to share spotlight. There's lots of ways you can do this, but let's take a look at how we can move those mechanics away from the sort of starting point and into gameplay. So our next focus area for coordination, because we have 3 for each, is going to be in combat tactics and strategies.
So we've talked a little bit about this in what we've said before about looking for ways that you can layer benefits on top of each other, like you were saying about reduce the damage and heal and give temporary hit points, or, the example of applying multiple buffs that assist a particular thing, or applying multiple debuffs to an opponent that make them particularly bad at something.
Yes, but I would say that one of the most fundamental ways you can coordinate and just kind of increase both party successfulness, because we're not just talking about optimization here, but also like amity and parties getting along, is to make sure that you do coordinate with the other players to the extent that you know what your goal is in the encounter and you have the same goal. As now, maybe you've chosen in session 0 that you want to be a little adversarial with the other players in your group, and you have different goals, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But in most games, we're going to assume that you're working together and fairly cooperative and less adversarial, in which case you want to make sure you have the same goal for the encounter. Let me give you a good example of how that can go awry. Not just if like one person's like, I'm going to kill this person, and the other one's like, no,
I want to spare them.
Let's spare them.
Yeah.
That's not the most common, or especially if someone's like, let's keep talking to them and somebody else is attacking them at the same time. That is something that you will definitely need to deal with. But even once you're in a combat encounter, you might have different goals for how to approach it. For instance, if the barbarian charges into the group of 12 enemies and the wizard wanted to fireball that group of 12 enemies.
You can't do that now. Because certain tactics prevent other tactics. Like once people have closed into melee, then you're not going to be doing, you're not going to be doing like the kite them from a distance approach. You're not going to be doing as much of those area attacks or things like that.
Yes. And you know what? In some of those cases, it's like, okay, it partially came down to initiative. Maybe it came down to communication. And it can be frustrating. But one of the best examples of not just the fact that the other character where they were on the map stopped you from using the spell, but just like of the game system causing like the groups to be working not at cross purposes, but in a way that makes some of the effort irrelevant, was ability damage back in Pathfinder 1 and 3rd edition D&D. So if you are, let's say, using in 3rd edition D&D the Ego Whip spell to do charisma damage to your enemy, and everybody else is doing hit point damage to the enemy, then you are not having the same goal. You're not going after the same number of, like, the same, like, points.
Point track. You're not
point tracker. You're not helping each other at all.
Yeah. So you would then want to be like, okay, I'm going to go for charisma damage on this enemy, and then you go for, it's like, you're going for that enemy on hit point, You're attacking the enemy with hit point damage. I'm thinking I'm going to take this one down with charisma damage.
Yeah.
And that way you're doing different, you're working on different tracks, and you're not like messing with each other. In the same way that like, one of the really useful coordinations that I often see in our home group is paying attention to how injured the enemy is. And if the enemy is at like very, very low hit points, then having some, instead of being like, okay, the barbarian's gonna barbarian smash them for tons and tons of damage, maybe the bard decides, okay, I'm gonna take a bow pot shot and see if I can finish them off so the barbarian can spend their high damage on something else.
Right. or do an AoE attack or something like that.
And when it comes to AoEs and battlefield control, you know, that can be challenging too because, like, you know, the person who built a character to run into melee wants to be able to run into melee and do things and not have, like, the person who's doing AoEs always be like, well, you can't do that because I want to do this. But, you know, there are ways that you can work together better by having, say, the person who's running into the combat, you know, maybe they don't run right into the center of everything. Maybe they run toward an opponent who's more to the outside, so they still leave the space for the wizard to drop the fireball. Or maybe they set themselves, or maybe they set themselves up in a choke point. Or, like, you know, they're a fighter or whatever, and they're setting themselves up in a choke point so that the enemies are going to have to come to them, and they're going to get reactive strike as they try to come around toward the person who did the fireball. Or maybe the battlefield control splits the combat in two by, like, putting a wall in the middle. And, you know, the barbarian player attacks one of the opponents that's closer to the front and then can clean up the opponents who are on the one side before the wall falls down or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to go back to the thing I was in the middle of talking about before that, which was the ability damage from 3rd edition. Because we didn't actually finish what I was going to say. So, when you have something like that where things are on separate tracks, and there's some game systems that just have, like, mental stress versus physical stress versus social stress. We're on different tracks. In Fate, in Mutants and Masterminds, there was at least in some of the editions, there was, like, lethal and non-lethal damage were on different tracks, so any amount of lethal you did not help you in non-lethal and vice versa. So if you are not well coordinated on that with your group, it's one of the worst things that could possibly happen. So, like, for example, I had a telepath character in 3.5, and I did have Ego Whip, and we came across a Boule, which it turned out had very, very low charisma. And so my character attempted to coordinate with the other characters because the Boule was attacking, like, a group of NPCs, and it was like, please protect the NPCs, but also stay back so you won't get hurt because this thing is dead. Don't waste resources. Don't waste your spells. Like, this is the one thing that I can take care of, and when we fight together, it won't help each other. And then nobody listened, and they attacked, and they did, like, some small amount of damage to it. They got wrecked, and then it was defeated by charisma damage.
Yeah.
So this was an example where player coordination was poor, and where, like, maybe I should have explained it to the players outside of game before, rather than trying to have my character explain it in character to them, like, during the encounter. And if you have something like this going on, it can definitely lead to resentment or annoyance for pretty much anyone in the group.
Yeah.
Because probably, like, I was kind of annoyed that we wasted resources, but I was probably the least annoyed, because the people who went in and pointlessly attacked for damage may have... Even though it was what my character said was going to happen, may have been annoyed that their damage was irrelevant and they got wrecked. And they weren't defending the NPCs. Yeah. So people who cared about the NPCs being defended also got annoyed. So in this case, make sure it's very clear what the win conditions are, what you're going for with other players before you engage in combat. If it's an ambush, maybe you don't know. And you have to make sure you also understand with your group how much of this coordination is in-game, in character, how much of it is metagame, and how much of the metagame coordination that your group is okay with, because some groups are, especially if it might make things more fun, some groups very much are not.
Yes.
So that's what I wanted to talk about in that
some groups might be, you know, like, you know, whatever you can communicate what you could say in a couple of seconds during combat, and other than that, that's it. Whereas other groups are more like, let's talk about tactics out of game.
Yeah, and Rico says in it's like in Magic, if you have a Millstone deck that's trying to run them out of cards versus a damage deck, and they're on the same team in a team Magic game, it's not going to be very good teamwork. And that's definitely true.
Yeah, and Robert says it's also a matter of expectations. Not everyone wants or expects tactical combat.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So we're kind of presupposing in this that we're talking about ways to do tactical combat because
if you don't want to play a tactical combat game, there are many RPGs out there that avoid having more tactical combat and are more about narrative combat, and might be a better choice than a tactical combat game if your group has enough people in it who don't want to do tactical combat. Now, your possible local minimum is where you have a group and you're all friends, and you definitely need to play with everyone in this group, and you can't just say no to one of the players. But one of those players does not want to play tactical combat. They're extremely untactical, and they constantly ruin every tactic that the rest of the team tries to do.
In that case, you probably want to strategize around making sure that they have a character that's less likely to cause that issue.
But what if they also really want to play just the one thing that they want to play?
So, like, if they want to play, we're kind of saying everyone may not want tactical combat, but most folks don't want to get TPK.
Well, that's true too. But if your group is, but that's one reason you could play a less tactical RPG. You could play easier. Like, if people just want to auto attack, even in a fairly tactical RPG, you can just like make all the opponents like one level weaker.
Yeah, at that point, we're out of player coordination and we're into more
GM changing things because the players can't really do much about
the
that.
encounters so that's.
But what would you do if one person, and you can't say that to get them out of the group, and you can't say to change their character because they just want to play the wizard that they can't prepare the spells right for, the barbarian who rushes in.
Yeah, what do you do if you? What if you do if you have Leroy Jenkins on your team? I would say that you have Leroy Jenkins on your team, and you want you probably, if you have Leroy on your team, you're gonna want to do encounters that have more opponents rather than one big tough opponent, so that Leroy can go rush at one of them, not get completely pasted, and then other people can do.
You're not the GM here. You're the players.
Yeah, so you're the players.
Yeah, you're the players. You're trying to coordinate with the fact that you have Leroy, and maybe there's 10 enemies, and Leroy runs right into the middle of them. And now you can't do AoE because Leroy's in the middle of the 10 enemies.
Well,
Leroy's getting beat up. Leroy's too far away to even easily heal Leroy on the first turn because Leroy used like the remastered Barbarian in PF2 and got extra movement speed and sudden charged in with an extra stride and moved like 105 feet. And your cleric is like, okay, good work, Leroy. You're 105 feet from me. Do you know how many rounds it will take me to be able to heal you?
No, I think that, you don't... Because Leroy's player probably would find that, phrasing that way, to be pretty accusatory. But, you kind of gotta let Leroy fall unconscious sometimes. Like, if the player is just gonna run straight in, and you...
What if Leroy is like, heal me, cleric, what are you doing?
And then it'd be like, well, informing, Leroy's teammates have more problems than Leroy Gia. Be like, well, I can't move that far in a turn. I can get to you next turn. And
yeah, I'm going as fast as I can.
I'm going as fast as I can. And then maybe the next time after the comment you talk to Leroy about, like, hey, if if we're that far apart from you, then we won't be able to heal you in the next fight. Maybe next time we can try getting a little closer before we start the fight, and then we'll be able to heal you or do these kinds of things. So, talking about it like after the fact, not directly in the combat where things might be more charged, and not like blaming them, but just being factual.
What if they never change their ways? That's what we were saying.
Yeah, you're saying
we started by saying what about the person who doesn't change their ways, because that was people was asking.
Yeah, but they just continually do that. I feel like at that point you just be like, oh, Leroy, and it's like, well,
that's so Leroy.
That's so Leroy, exactly.
If we're presupposing it's not someone you
like Coach was saying,
at
least of the other players do we want to have Leroy be the main character of every game we play? Yeah, and I think that at that point, it becomes that's so Leroy situation, and if Leroy's player is getting upset with you because you're not contorting everything, then you really just need to talk to the GM at that point, because you could have a group that still works where Leroy where Leroy charges in, Leroy falls unconscious, and then like on round 3 you wake up Leroy and you've done some other things and you're like, oh haha, that's Leroy. But like if everybody's getting annoyed by it, you need to talk to the GM. There's only so much that players can do, or like talk to the person and be like, dude/lady, like.
It's also possible, depending on if the game system you're playing is very, very impossible for anyone to like lose or die, that Leroy's character will die based on this. And then the question is, do they bring in Leroy the second, who's literally a copy of Leroy and is literally named Leroy the Second, or do they bring something else? That could be a chance for the other players to be like, I really wanted to save Leroy. I think I would have been able to do it if he didn't keep running 105 feet away from the rest of us, and we can't keep up. And maybe the death of Leroy would change the ways of the Leroy player.
Yeah.
But,
and you could try to talk to them about, like, making a character that wouldn't have those same problems. Like, you know, if they were playing an archer, if they were playing a character that had some other type of thing going on, then they wouldn't have those issues.
Rico says, here's your backfire mantle, Leroy. The rest is up to you.
Yep. Like that meme on Reddit that's like, I got a gift for this sorcerer. It's a backfire mantle. It's a backfire mantle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely our wizard Eustace.
Yeah, because, I mean, more realistically, you'll have a player that, like, sometimes does that and, like, not somebody... And then you can, like, talk to them about, like, what kind of tactical stuff do you want to have going on in the game and how they can make sure that they can get what they want out of the combat and you get what you want out of the combat. Like, I feel like the player who's like, I'm going to continue to Leroy Jenkins every single time and then complain that everything doesn't go my way is, like, not quite parodical, but is an extreme situation.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move to the third of the mechanical coordinations, which we talked about. Combat encounter tactics. Let's talk about exploration and downtime coordination.
So exploration first. I mean, you probably want someone searching for traps.
Just in general, I would say that exploration and downtime can be combined together in a certain way, which is that talk to the other players, in character if you prefer, out of character if you prefer. What are the most important things that you want to make sure gets done during this exploration or downtime? What are the nice to haves?
Yeah.
Then figure out who would be best at doing which thing.
Yeah.
And if you want to have multiple people work together on something. So you can figure out, like, maybe Skillsy McSkillpants is actually the answer. Well, I'm actually the best at all of these things.
Yeah.
But maybe there's one of those things that Skillsy McSkillpants is way better than the next best person on.
Or maybe Skillsy McSkillpants is the only one who can do one of those things, but someone else could do one of the others.
That's correct. So, for example, in Iron Fang Invasion, there was a section, I don't know if the GM sort of, like, made it more in-depth and complicated than the original adventure. If the adventure had this, but where you could roll all sorts of skills checks to, like, get ready for an army attacking. There were a whole bunch. And so I was a player in that group, and my character is also a kind of a very coordinating type character, and I'm a pretty coordinating type player. So I coordinated I talked to everybody about which things we thought were the most important, if we couldn't get everything done first. Then I had people tell me their modifiers and things, and I made a list of all of the things we could do, and then sort of prioritized based on who had a huge comparative advantage in things that we considered important. And then I showed people my suggestion for, like, where to assign everybody to start out with, and then it was like, if we finish this, then you can go on to that. And then I let people make feedback. We made some small adjustments, and then we just used that as the plan.
Because we all talked in the beginning about what do we want to accomplish, and then it's like, what can we make as a plan for how? And then Mark's like, how do I make a plan for us to be able to accomplish whatever everyone wants to accomplish?
And that was sort of a subsystem-y thing. But when I'm talking about exploration, we're also sort of talking about that there could be a subsystem. There could be something else that happens, and it's not just like a basic, I'm walking down the dungeon corridor.
Or like it's an influence system, and like you. And, you know, having the group talk and decide, like, okay, you know, you know, person A thinks, oh, it's most important to influence NPC 1, and, like, person B thinks, oh, it's most important to influence NPC 2.
But they're actually good at influencing the opposite.
Yeah, but they're actually good at but then the other players don't really have an opinion or whatever, and then the group can come together and be like, okay, you know, how do we make sure that as a group we influence NPCs 1 and 2, and then we can decide what to do after that based on, like, what other people might be good at or what we might be able to do.
So maybe you have this plan for 1 and 2, but then you're like, you know what, though? Bob's character
is really good at influencing
Bob's character, has the highest warfare lore possible with his commander, and this general really likes talking about warfare lore in his NPC 3. And Bob's character is maybe not great at influencing one or two. Could maybe gather information about the other NPCs, but we don't necessarily need that. But we could to try to give an advantage, or maybe Bob should just influence the NPC 3 anyway because he's so good at it that he'll do it quickly.
Yeah.
And so you can come up with strategies and ways to do that. You can do it in character, talking as your PCs. You can do it out of character, looking at more of the numbers and strategizing. You can do a little both, do some out of character, get people to kind of agree out of character, and then do an in character conversation
that
where
brings that together.
Brings that into the game. It depends
or,
on your group's meta.
Or in character first, and then out of character for sort of the brass tacks of it, because you don't necessarily want to come up with a way to translate the length of conversation that it would take to, or your group finds it awkward to be like, I think we should convince them, or by appealing to their higher nature or whatever, versus I think we should tell them a story that they'll believe or whatever.
So find what's right for your group in terms of how you set this up, and I think that's what you need to do with exploration. And with Downtime, it's kind of similar. Downtime often is where characters go after some of their own personal goals, and that's totally fine. When you're coordinating between players, this is not to say that your group needs to turn into some kind of hive mind.
Yeah.
Yes, you don't have to turn into some kind of hive mind as we are the group, resistance is futile.
Well, I think I tried to get that as an example with one player thinks this is most important, the other player thinks the other thing is the most important. How do you, as a group, try to make sure that everybody gets what they want at a particular situation? Or if not everybody can this time, because there's not time to research a ritual for the bard this time because we have too many things going on that are on fire, and the group as a whole agrees that. But then next time we have a downtime, we'll prioritize researching a ritual for the bard because we had to make sure that the city didn't get exploded or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Going back for a moment into tactics, I see Rohit mentioned, seriously, getting players to understand battlefield control is challenging. Many marginal players feel insulted if they aren't striking every turn, even if that is suboptimal in some situations. It's very true. I've even talked about it a little bit online. I made a Reddit thread about it at one point, and there was some interesting opinions back and forth, because sometimes you can have a tactic that is so effective that you can have the group take almost no damage or 0 damage on a severe encounter, but it sometimes will force the martial characters to not get a strike every turn, or to be melee characters who are forced to strike using their backup bow for a little bit because you're drawing the enemy to you when the enemy doesn't have enough moves to get to you in even with one full turn. And
those kind of tactics can be really fun to pull off as something that you do occasionally. But, as a group, it's also important to recognize, are the melee players not getting to shine, or some of the characters not getting to shine and do their thing.
So I don't think Rohit is talking about every encounter is kited and the melees never get to attack, because Rohit said
the opposite.
Many martial players feel insulted if they aren't striking every turn.
Yeah.
So it's more of a, how do you get players to be okay with passing one turn or doing something that is kind of weird and not their main thing for even a single turn.
I see, yeah.
And while I am very pro coordinating tactics, and I like doing weird tactics, you could see the perspective. I mean, it makes it sound like they're extremists, like they won't even skip a single turn. But on the other hand, in some tactical RPGs, especially if you have a big group, it could be an hour before they get their next turn.
And you're like, oh gosh, okay, right? I guess that's all that I do.
And they could miss on their next turn. Or maybe they missed on the previous turn.
And they're like, oh, now I just don't
and now I don't even get to do a turn. So, there can be, there's a lot of good reasons why some martial players feel insulted if they aren't even striking every turn. But I think it can be very fun and satisfying if you can have a conversation as a group and get people to the point where it's okay to do something different.
I think that, as Gustav was talking about enjoying setup turns, I think that as players, if your character benefits greatly from setup, or benefits from the setup that another character does, having your character acknowledge that and be grateful and talking about the role that played in your success. you know, the GM can certainly do that, but you as a player can do that too, to like help the player realize the part that they played in the group success as a whole.
For example, in one of the severe encounters, actually the one I was talking about on Reddit, it was a while ago. It was the opponent was pretty dangerous. In the end, they got to do almost nothing. But we also rolled out to see what would have happened if we hadn't done one of the sort of kitey things, and one of the marginal characters would have died. So it was interesting because we were like, wow, how much damage did we mitigate by doing this? And we determined that one of the marginal characters, the one who actually got like the most stuff that they missed and didn't get to do when they hung back and used a bow and didn't roll high, was actually would have died if we had done it the other way. So that's an interesting way to like show the value of the kitey strategy. Not just knocked unconscious, but died because they were inside of a complex hazard that was gonna hit them again. And we were like, so that she would have gone down from that crit. That would have put her at dying 2 instead of just being up after the crit. Now let's roll to see what her saving throw would have been against the complex hazard, because in this other hypothetical, we ran into the room where there was a complex hazard, which what we actually did was kite from outside the room and force the boss to come to us, and we didn't ever go into the hazard. And we rolled, and she would have critically failed the reflex because she was unconscious. And died. So that obviously was something that would help the player of that martial character.
But that would require the GM to be willing to run the
that did require the GM to do something. Although, even if the GM just told you what, at that point, the players would have just needed, hey GM, we finished this encounter. What was the DC of that hazard we didn't get hit by? And if they even just said that, then we could be like, the players could just among themselves roll the reflex save to see and be like, oh yeah, you would have died. Even if the GM doesn't tell you the DC, just have them roll the reflex save anyway if you feel like doing it, and if it was low enough, then like, I bet that would have failed. And even the GM's like, I refuse to tell you. Then you still could guess that it might have critically failed and caused the character to die, or if you didn't, if the GM said, that would have been a critical failure.
So another thing I think that coordinating the downtime also, like, to go back to that, you can also have your character look for ways that they can assist the other characters with what they're trying to do. I'm realizing this is going to start getting a little more into what we're going to be talking about next, which is sort of the story and the narrative thing, if you're going to be helping them with their goals and such.
That's right. Because goals is one of the things we want to talk about. But in terms of downtime, just like think about what the party's overall goals are, how downtime can help you accomplish those. And it might be possible, just like with the exploration, that the person who's doing the thing is not the one who cares about it the most. For instance, maybe the fighter always wanted a legendary sword, but actually the alchemist is better at crafting. And the fighter can help what the alchemist wanted, which is to have a shop, and the fighter is better at schmoozing and can help get like the nobles to agree to give the alchemist a shop while the alchemist is crafting the fighter the sword. You can have trade-offs in downtime like that. But let's use that as a transition to move into talking about story coordination. And we're going to start that with something that's at the beginning that would be only really viable at session 0 unless you're kind of trickling your story along the way, which is backstory coordination. This is a situation where your characters have some kind of connection in their backstory that is an important part of what the characters have done even before you started the campaign.
Now this could be that the characters knew each other and have a pre-existing connection, or it could even be that there are elements of the character's backstory that you know are likely to interface in some way. Like, your characters, both graduated from the same academy.
Even though they weren't in the same year.
Or, like, your characters are, were part of organizations that were rivals with each other, or things like that. Some sort of fact about the characters that's likely to come up in their story and cause them to have shared experiences or beliefs. About each other.
Your characters came from rival monk monasteries that each think that their monastery is the best and the other one doesn't know what they're doing. For instance, that could be a possibility. And there's all sorts of things you can have there. up to and including like your characters being related, which we'll cover at the end when we talk about relationships between characters, because that can get the most complex of everything. So when you're coordinating backstory, obviously there might be some elements of this that you need to talk to the GM for. However, usually that would only be if you're doing something in your backstory that you would need to talk to the GM, if anyway, just for having it in your backstory at all. Whereas, assuming you're doing something in your backstory you wouldn't have needed to talk to your GM, then you probably don't need to talk to them about coordinating that part of your backstory with the other character. So if you're like, yes, my character is an 1,000,000-year-old god, and you're my last worshiper, or something like that. Then,
you needed to talk to the GM
you needed to talk to the GM about the 1,000,000-year-old god.
Yeah.
So it is something you can do with player coordination when you're talking about backstory. I mean, of course, the GM might read your backstory and veto something or ask, hey, can we adjust this? But that's true anytime you write a backstory.
Yeah, absolutely, because there might be something that doesn't quite work with the story, or a way that something can be slightly adjusted to work even better. Along with that general theme. And sometimes if you're running if you have existing backgrounds that are for the adventure, like if you're running an adventure that has pre-written backgrounds or your GM has created them, then you can go off of those, and those might suggest some kind of connection. But so it's both the literal connections where they knew each other, and things that they may have in common. It may also be things like it may not necessarily be something so direct as we both went to the same academy. It may be something about like their philosophy or belief systems that you put into there, that that they're going to agree or disagree on certain points.
It can be also not just a commonality, but a difference. For example, if you want to have a character who's like Miranda from The Tempest, who just like doesn't understand certain things about, or is like not seeing some things in the world around her, you could also have someone who specifically plays a character that knows about that thing, or that represents that thing. And so that's like an asymmetry that can still be very interesting in play, that you kind of set up in advance like a Chekhov's gun. And so that there's all sorts of things you can do in your backstory to make them sort of work together. And sometimes you can make it so that they are abrasive to each other for an interesting story, but you want to make sure that your group, obviously, if the two players coordinated, then two are okay with that. But make sure that your group is generally okay with an abrasive or rivalrous situation among the characters, because that may not be something that the other players are super looking forward to, for example.
Yeah, especially if it takes up a lot of table time, or if their rivalry extends into, for them actively bickering, or if like their rivalry extends into them having contests about what they're going to be doing next, and then that takes a lot of table time.
Right. So, in addition to your background and your backstory, in the past, there's also goals you have for the future. And this ties in with downtime, like we mentioned before. So, you can coordinate with other players about your goals, either in session 0 to try to make sure the goals might be aligned, or even just during the game.
Because goals will often change and adapt over time based on circumstances.
And you're going to want to know what the other players and their characters' goals are, both the player, if they have like their own goal that the character doesn't know about yet, and the characters, what their goals are, because as a team, as friends, both out of character hopefully, and in character also hopefully, you're going to want to be able to help other people achieve their goals, and they might be able to help you achieve yours. And by figuring out what goals people have, you might be able to, like in the example with the alchemist and the fighter, swap over who's helping who do what. Or maybe you discover that it's like, well, my goal is that my bard wants to be the most popular singer in town. And the cleric's goal is that a demon apocalypse will destroy the world in a month if we don't do this one ritual. I think my bard could be okay with like putting that being the best singer in town on hold for the demon apocalypse goal, because there is going to be no town.
And I find that like with characters, you can also, as a player model this. I find that with my characters, if I'm not sure, where am I going with them? It can be useful to think through and set a short-term goal, a medium-term goal, and a long-term goal. Where short-term goal is kind of like, what are they going to be looking to accomplish like in the next session or two? Medium-term goal is more like, what are they going to be looking to accomplish like in this next campaign arc? And long-term goal is kind of like, where do they see themselves like at the end of the campaign?
Absolutely. And those can change.
Those games can absolutely change too. But then,
in fact, the short term kind of has to.
The short term is constantly changing, yeah. But maybe they will continue to adapt. But that way, like where your character is heading, and then it gives you a framework to kind of talk to other players about like what is your character looking to accomplish.
Yep. Rico says, "Stop the demon apocalypse with one weird ritual." I'll raise you that and say, your GM doesn't want you to know this one weird ritual that will stop the demon apocalypse.
And the frequency with which characters' goals changed has a big impact on how they feel. Like I'm playing a character now who I would say her short-term goal is constantly changing because she sees something else. She's like, oh, I want to try that. Oh, I want to try that. But like her medium and long-term goals are fairly stable.
Mm-hmm.
But short-term is just like, wee!
Rico says you can use the publicity from stopping the apocalypse to advertise the band. Yeah, absolutely. So the clerk can say, we'll do the apocalypse thing first and then use that. Like...
And then Rowan said being a popular singer might help get material.
It could go in either direction. Yeah. But, like, in a lot of cases, that's an element that can be satisfying. For instance, in the JRPG Lunar Silver Star story, there's a character who's one of the, like... NPCs who joined your party temporarily who always wanted to start a store. Mm-hmm. And he's your main character's like best friend. And at the end, he has a store, he sells you stuff, and at the end, basically, it's like, this apocalypse will destroy the world. And he's like, look, buddy, everything in the store is free. You want consumables? You want to fill your bag with the most expensive ones? It is free. You need to save the world. And then some of his employees are like, he's really giving everything out for free. Mm-hmm. And then after, in the end, in the epilogue, if you beat the game, you talk back and it's like, oh my gosh, he's being advertised as the store that helped the hero save the world. And he's made back 10 times as much money as the amount of things he gave you for free before the final battle. And so, like, those kind of stories kind of stick with you and they make sense. And it can feel good to put your goal on hold for another goal when it makes sense in the sort of the narrative.
Oh, my guy has a punching puppet galleon. That's awesome.
Yeah, the punching puppet galleon came with the pre-order.
Yeah,
Linda, we used to have that until I think it burned down with the house.
I think it did. Yeah.
But the little punching puppet galleon came with the original Lunar pre-order.
Mm-hmm.
In any case. Goals are something that you want to coordinate because obviously that's got to be something the bard player decides. I'm going to put my being the best singer on hold so we can stop the demon apocalypse. You don't want the cleric necessarily to be like, come on, your thing is really vain and it's going to take a year. And the apocalypse will at least a year to be the top singer. You should stop and do my cleric thing because that could seem a little pushy. That could make the bard player feel bad. Mm-hmm. So you want it to be a group discussion and hopefully it comes from the direction of the bard player.
Also, it's just fun as a group to have a mixture of goal severity. Like, when you have some people who are like, I'm going to become the greatest bard in the world. And some people are like, I want to get a new puppy. Like, so you have like a different feel or a different focus, and someone's like, I will master the art of ritual magic.
That's right. I will become a god. I want a new puppy.
Yep.
It's like, okay, guys. So, I want to make it clear, the Starstone test, everyone knows you can just go into the cathedral and become a god. That's easy enough. Mm-hmm. But puppy adoption is a really complicated thing. There's lots of forms you have to fill out. There's not always enough puppies. So I'm not...
You're going to need to make sure that you have a good home environment. I'm not sure what the adoption inspectors are going to think about the fact that you're going off into life or death situations all the time. Do you have a plan for making sure the puppy is taken care of if you get incapacitated?
I'm just going to say this, which is that Caden Killian may have wanted a K-Hound, but he failed to adopt the puppy because he was drunk and he didn't come to the meeting. Norgorber failed to adopt a puppy because all of the adoption people were coming to check out Norgorber's home environment kept disappearing for some reason. Only Iomade actually successfully adopted a puppy, but all 3 of them became gods, so we could tell which goal is harder.
It turned out the puppy adoption form was inside the Starstone.
Actually, there was one person who passed the Starstone Bridge because they accidentally crossed it because they were thinking that they had to go there to get the puppy adoption form.
There you go.
And they were the first person ever to cross it while doing a puppy adoption form.
There you go. So I think that's
so
goals.
That's goals. Let's go to the hardest part of all this coordination. And it can be connected to goals. It can be connected to backstory. That is building a coordinated relationship between 2 players. Now, there could be an entire episode on player characters that have relationships with other player characters. In fact, I think we may have done that episode.
Yeah, I think we have.
Several years ago. I can't remember. You could check on YouTube to see if it is. But when we talk about pre-coordinating these things, obviously, they sometimes happen in play and they weren't pre-coordinated. That is like catching lightning in a bottle, though. It's very unlikely. Yeah. Most of the time, especially where it goes well and happens in play, because if you think your character wants to be in a relationship of some kind that happens in play, it probably wasn't like a sibling or a parent relationship because it happened in play. It's probably a romantic relationship, and that is opening up 10 cans of worms.
10 cans of worms, absolutely. So let's talk about sort of the familial relationships first. Oftentimes your characters will know about those in advance of the story, although you could work probably with both the player and...
The Luke Leia secret sister.
You work with you probably be working with the GM partially too in this case if you want to have it revealed that they were actually your long lost sibling or something like that. But yeah, generally those kinds of relationships, the characters are going to come in being more connected to each other. So one thing to keep in mind with that is particularly if you and that other player know each other better than other players at the table, making sure that you don't use that in-character relationship is a reason to have your 2 characters like kind of mesh together too much in the way that they do things. Yeah, you don't want your characters to be too cliquish, and in a few different ways. One, being insular and not talking to the other players. 2, like kind of using a block voting to outvote other players. And 3, which is using the fact that you're 2 to like potentially, maybe not on purpose even, but get more than two out of however many players there are worth of spotlight because you want to do the same thing. Yeah. And this is something that the GM may need to work with you on as well. But making sure that, those characters need to, like, disagree with each other about some things and have ways in which they're more connected to other characters and their goals. Exactly. If you want to have a relationship starting out with one of the other characters, players' characters, think about how you can have a different relationship that is not a 3-way relationship that gives you an even bigger block, but it's instead just a different connection to another character that's in the group. And you can see this in some, like, famous role-playing groups, right? Like, so, for example, if you're talking about Critical Role's Vox Machina, there is Vex and Vax, who are the brother and sister. But then also there are, like, romantic connections that they potentially have with some of the other characters that are in the group. And so those can create interplay, but they're not automatically a 3-person interconnection with each other. And so therefore, you have, you not only have multiple different connections, you also have one person who, like, in that party, they also have, like, the barbarian and the cleric who, like, kind of, like, the barbarian had been part of a group that was, like, murdering the people with the cleric's town, and then stopped and, like, fought against the rest of their own people and saved the cleric's family and was kind of adopted. So they were, like, adopted siblings. So if you have tons of different connections, you're less likely to have a problem than if you have just the 1-2 connection and they all in their own space and they're not really connecting with the rest of the group. And there's a lot of things you can do with those kinds of connections too. I mean, if both players are amenable, because someone who knows them well, like a sibling that they grew up with, is going to see a different side of them and have known them for a really long time. And maybe be able to bring in those stories of the past. Like, because it can be fun to be like, hey, you know, remember that time when you... It's like, oh, don't tell them that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can try to build out more aspects of your character in that way.
Absolutely.
And, you know, how does that other character see you based on how you were in the past, and how might you have grown from then? So there may be cases where, you know, the rest of your party can see you more clearly because they're not seeing you through the lens of who you were.
Yes. Also, when you're deciding that
especially if your characters have been separated for a while and then are back together for this adventure.
If you're deciding you're going to coordinate a connection between characters, and you have a connection that is like a stronger, more clickish connection with one of the other players, you may want to consider doing the character connection with someone else.
Yes.
So, for example, if Linda and I were playing in a campaign and with other people we didn't know that well, and we decided that our characters were siblings or were married or something like that, that could cause our characters to have a very insular shtick. And we have done that before sometimes in one-shots.
In
one-shots
and stuff, yeah.
We played like siblings who had a shtick, because sometimes the shtick is useful in one-shots. Mm-hmm. But it could be interesting to have a deeper relationship with someone you don't know as well. And that way you'll kind of always be able to be more likely to play off the person that you really know as a player.
Yeah.
Even though you didn't have the deeper relationship with their character.
Absolutely.
And so that way, what you're looking for when you're doing this is to make a cool dynamic with the player or players you're coordinating with, while not doing something that might like sort of tilt or distort the overall party dynamic. Now, if you can get everybody on board with you doing these coordinations, create all sorts of a web of interconnections, that's great. But usually you can't.
Yeah.
Assuming you're watching this video and you're like, darn it, I'm going to do coordinations, you're one person who wants to do that. Usually you'll
find
one other person who, because you're the one who instigates it. You'll find one person who wouldn't instigate it, but they're definitely into it when you're the one who comes up with it. They're going to play along. But you might be lucky to have more than that.
Yeah, but you can still find ways to build those connections with other players during the adventure. Like, you know, does your character look up to another character for certain reasons? Or are there things that they come to that other character for advice on, or things like that?
That's right.
And then once they initiate that sort of thing, then it would be more natural for the other player to role play at building friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing you can do also during, see if you can do during session 0, or if the GM is into it, is try to make some connection with every other character. Some game systems like Fate tries to have some of your aspects tied to a connection you have to other characters. And you could do that, just be like, okay, it doesn't have to be a huge connection, but let's try to think of some kind of connection that we're going to have. Doesn't have to be as deep as a relationship. But if you're going to have a relationship with one character, having at least some connection or interesting thing for every other character will help you fall out of the rut of just like kind of constantly only going with the relationship character. And it could be,
you know, like they both are, you know, they're both interested in woodworking. You know, it doesn't have to be something super complicated, but something that they could connect over.
That's right. It doesn't have to be super as deep in the character as we had one Fate game where the trouble of 2 of the 3 characters was friend of the 3rd character.
Yes.
Because in Fate you have like a high concept for your character that's like, what is your main thing? Your trouble, what often causes issues, and then your other aspects.
So that's a game that we played where Mark usually GM, but I GM sometimes, and then like we had a character that was, and
there you had a character that was like a shared character that was the trouble character who was constantly getting everybody else into trouble. We each had
a regular PC, and then the other one would flip back over to the GM when they were, and then like that, the trouble character was always in the hands of the player to cause nonsense.
And that kind of worked well for that group where it was just like, yes, Billy is dragging everybody into these problems because he was kind of like the Mulder character who was just constantly just like, there's weird stuff going on, I'm going to prove it.
And like the GM would sometimes briefly take control of that character if it was like, because they knew there was, like, some situation that they needed him to stumble into, and then the player would be like, okay, now how do you respond?
Or it would just be the beginning of the
Yeah,
adventure.
it
It would
is-
start
he
off
was-
with, like,
he's like in that situation.
he had found out about something
Yeah.
in between the sessions or
Exactly,
something like that,
yeah.
and then the player is in control at that point.
Once actual decisions were being made about how things were going to be handled, yeah.
That's true, and he would always snoop around on things,
Mhm.
especially if Linda was playing him.
Yes.
Remember when you broke into the psychologist or the psychiatrist's office and then just read up on people's things because Billy was sure that it would prove that everybody... There was like mole people that were like infiltrating the town. Yep. Good times.
Yeah, Billy was a bit of a menace.
Yep. He also had his random gun that he had that was...
Billy should not have been allowed to have a gun.
He should not have been allowed to have a gun.
I mean, it is true that he only used it, like, to defend his friends from supernatural monsters that were attacking them, but, like, he's not the world's most stable child.
That's true. Well, you have to be pretty unstable to have other people's trouble be friend of Billy.
Yep. Anyway.
Okay, so we've talked about now coordinating your build, coordinating combat encounters, coordinating outside combat encounters in exploration, subsystems, downtime, coordinating your backstories, goals, and relationships with characters.
Yeah, I think one more thing to touch on is, because we've kind of talked around this, but that if you want to do if you want to have a romantic relationship, that's something very much to talk to with the GM and all the players at the table, and make sure that the way that is portrayed is something that's going to be comfortable for everybody. And that if it ever slips over into the territory that's not, then you can rein it back in.
Make sure you have some lines and veils for that kind of stuff, because it's generally a good idea. So if anybody who is watching right now in chat has any questions about this, let us know. Other than that, we've covered our main topic. So at the end of the episode, we always like to vote for our next episode.
Indeed.
And that's what we're going to do.
So poll is incoming.
I have a sneaky suspicion.
You can remove the question marks because I've agreed that we can do that.
It's black and I can't read what it says.
You got them there. Perfect. You got it. Yep.
It was hard to read it because it was black.
Black against gray. Yes.
Against gray. It turned white now that I put it there.
Indeed.
Is it normally black against gray? Yeah, I guess it is.
Yep. In this particular chat window. There may be some way to get it to change. Maybe it's because it's in dark mode. I have a sneaky suspicion
I know what's going to win the vote, but we'll see.
We shall see, indeed.
We'll see. Maybe it will be Build an NPC Workshop, which almost tied last time.
That is true.
Could be Arcane Mark Plays. It is Saturday. You never know.
4. Let us return to Saturday Tyranny.
Nah ha ha.
Is the first vote.
4.
Ooh, I guess I better start getting the,
Okay, we better start figuring out what game we're going to play.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's do this. So, let's see, what did we have?
A was just...
We had a King of the Castle, but A was usually a Strya, because we had only done that one time.
And then B was Backpack Hero, I think.
Which we can do another time if we want.
And then we definitely want King of the Castle in there again.
Yeah, well, that's always funny. We can do potentially another Wildermyth campaign.
Wasn't the last one on there Galaspire Survivors last time?
Let's see. We did have Galaspire Survivors. Galaspire Survivors. And, is there something else that we want to add to it?
We can check our multiplayer category on here. See if anything inspires.
Let's see. Let's take a look at possible things for us to do.
Well, these are things we are in the middle of.
That's true. We can just do this for now.
We can take a look
next time. If we, because once we get into tyranny of something, then it's more likely to win the time after that.
Indeed, indeed.
So vote for A, B, C, D, or E.
Absidy.
Abkadevki Jekyllmanop for Suvixes.
What?
Abkadevki Jekyllmanop for Suvixes.
Oh, yeah, I guess that is the alphabet. There we go.
Yes. It's the most remarkable word I've ever seen. All right, let's see.
We have D, anything, A.
D, anything, A. All right. So, we'll see which one wins in terms of these votes, and then we can try to play that next week, and we can look to see if we have more game possibilities.
XP yet?
I did.
Okay, awesome.
I did give people
Second
XP.
vote for A.
Second vote for Estrella. And
Estrella.
what?
B, backpack hero. Dab.
Dab. So it looks like Estrella will have it unless we get at least one more vote.
Mm-hmm. How many folk do we have on right now?
How many folk?
Yes.
We have some number of folk. We have
Okay.
10 folk.
Yes. So half of the people have said something.
That's true. All right. Well, we'll do it. We'll do Estrella. So we're gonna do
Mark Plays.
Arcade Mark Plays
will be
Estrella.
our next
Will be our
Saturday
next
episode.
thing.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend or rest of your week or whatever you are watching us.
We'll see you on Tuesday for what's the one on Tuesday?
What is the one on Tuesday? What one last time?
I'll look on Twitch because that actually has a list of what the things are.
It's hard to remember. There's so many episodes.
There are a lot of episodes. So, it should be...
And about, I think?
I think it's...
Oh, are you going to find it through chat? Yeah.
I think it's down here. So, on Tuesday, it is going to be GM Tools preparing multiple options.
Yeah,
Then next Saturday, we'll play Estrella. And then, the Tuesday after that, then it could be anything. We'll vote for it. So, take care, everyone. We'll see you